on a regular Wednesday afternoon on October 3rd, 1984, 9-year-old Christine Jessop got off her school bus and headed home. She had the house to herself for a few minutes because her mom and brother Kenny were at an appointment. Christine would have loved to join her mom and Kenny, but as it turned out, she had better things to do anyways. She was meeting her friend Leslie at the park to go play. She sorted through the change dish and located a nickel, then went to the corner store to buy a piece of gum. She had made plans that day to meet Leslie at the park just across the street from the store. As arranged, Leslie arrived at the park and waited for Christine to show, and then waited some more. Janet arrived home with Kenny roughly 10 minutes later, at around 4:10 p.m. Oddly, Christine's red bicycle was lying on its side, its kickstand damaged. They walked inside and noticed that Christine's jacket was hanging on the hook higher than the little girl could reach on her own. Her school bag was on the counter, and the mail and newspaper had been bought inside. Around 5 p.m., Christine still hadn't returned home, so Janet went to the park to search for her. She walked through the cemetery calling out her daughter's name. She phoned Christine's friends, including Leslie Chipman, who explained that she went home when Christine didn't show up for their park date. Janet tried to suppress her panic. She could be hard, with her sharp green eyes, pursed lips, and salty vocabulary, but Christine brought out her tender side. The pair were close, they did everything together, and despite giving her kids the illusion of freedom, Janet almost always knew where they were. She had left Christine unsupervised for just 20 minutes. And suddenly, every parent's nightmare happened. Christine, her sweet, sensitive little girl, was missing. After sunset, Janet called the York Regional Police. Missing children cases were common enough at the time, but they were usually solved within 48 hours. The most frequent explanation was parental abduction or child runaway. But in this case, neither scenario made sense. Both Christine's parents were accounted for, and Christine wasn't the type of child to run away or even wander off. When she went to visit her grandparents for the weekend, sure, she'd frequently call home just to say hi. The York force was small, with one officer for every 860 residents. They had no major crimes unit and had never dealt with a child abduction or a child murder. Almost immediately, their lack of experience showed. When a constable arrived on scene, he removed Christine's coat from the hook for closer inspection. Detectives came in through the back and side doors. The plastic wrapping of the newspaper was thrown away without being dusted for fingerprints. Well-meaning neighbors passed in and out of the home, touching this and touching that. If Christine had been abducted, crucial evidence was now being compromised. Police did set up a command post in the nearby fire hall and enlisted residents to help conduct a series of searches of the area. Still, day after day, not a trace of Christine. The disappearance defied explanation. In tiny Queensville, how could a little girl just simply vanish? Quote, "We are full of anxiety and concern," a volunteer told the Toronto Star. There is a feeling of disbelief that something like this could happen here. Welcome back to Unjust Crimes. My name is Michelle, and this is the abduction and murder of Christine Jessop of Queensville, Ontario, Canada. Okay, so heads up, this case is about the murder of a child. So if you want to skip this one, I'll catch you on the next one. I do promise that I will not go into much detail about what happened to Christine, but I do feel like her story needs to be told. And I think despite the decades of sorrow and unknowing for her family, at the end of the day, her case was solved with genetic genealogy. And I think it's important to highlight cases that have been solved with genetic genealogy because, well, if nothing else, these cases give other families hope. Hope that their story one day may too end with the case being solved and answers to what happened to their loved one. Though Christine's case does have an ending, sadly, justice would never prevail. Despite that, I think we are only seeing the beginning of what genetic genealogy will mean for many unsolved tragic cases. So as I tell Christine's story, I want to focus more on how the tragedy affected her family throughout the decades, the investigation, a wrongful conviction, and how police finally found her real killer. Not that what happened to Christine wasn't important, because it was, but she was just 9 years old, and I don't feel it's necessary to share the gory details. They are out there if anybody is so inclined to look them up, but that is not what I want to focus on. Christine Marion Jessop was born on November 29, 1974, to parents Bob and Janet Jessop. She had an older brother, Kenny, who was 5 years her senior. The family lived in Queensville, Ontario, which is a small town about 61 kilometers or about an hour's drive outside of Toronto. In 1984, Queensville, Ontario had a handful of homes that were clustered around a general store, a church, a cemetery, and a playground. It was an idyllic, rural town where most faces were familiar and most front doors were left unlocked. Parents shooed their kids out of the house to play with their toys and dig in the dirt and whatnot, as long as they were back before the streetlights came on. By all accounts, the small town was a peaceful area, a wonderful place to raise a family with low crime, and it was a tight-knit community. Christine was a sweet child who loved animals, especially her pet beagle, Freckles, who she called Frecky, and she also had a pet frog that she kept in the family's basement, and his name was Harold. Her mother once told a story of how Christine had slept outside beside baby chicks so they wouldn't be alone overnight. She was a typical child of the 80s, and I can say that because she was only 3 years older than me, so I spent my young childhood years in the 80s. Times were very, very different. I've talked about it before in some other cases. Kids had more freedom and spent way more time outside, usually without a lot, if any, parental supervision, particularly in small towns. So anyways, Christine loved to be outside, running around, climbing trees, riding her bike, spending time with her dog. My goodness, I feel like I'm telling you my childhood. She was said to be somewhat of a tomboy, but she also still had a girly side. She loved her stuffed animals, especially her favorite stuffed rabbit named Thumper. Christine loved sports, especially baseball. She had a new bike, and according to her mother, Janet, it was her prized possession. She handled it very well and took good care of her bike. She and her brother were said to be close, despite their 5-year age gap. Kenny loved his little sister and took it as his responsibility to look out for her. Bob, Christine's father, was in jail at the time she disappeared and had been for about 3 weeks. Details on why are scarce and really not that important to the story other than he wasn't around. He was in a detention center for somehow swindling seniors out of money, so basically he stole some money. I have no idea how much or from whom, but Bob Jessop had swindled some elderly friends of the family and was in the Toronto East Detention Center for an 18-month stay. The day started like any other day. The kids woke up, had breakfast, and headed off to school for the day. Christine was in the 4th grade and was always excited to get to school at Queensville Public School. This day, she was set to take the bus home and let herself into the family home. While in school that day, she spent time with her friend Leslie Chipman, and the plan was to go home, gather up their dolls, and head to the nearby park to play at around 4 o'clock. She also received a recorder that day in school in music class, and it had her name on it on a piece of paper that was taped to the side. So a recorder is a musical instrument that they give you in music class in school. It's a woodwind instrument that has a clear flute-like sound. Did you get one in school? I know I did. And I think I was about Christine's age, and I remember learning how to play hot cross buns. And I can't help but every time I hear about Christine with her recorder, I picture her learning that in school too. Though I don't think she actually got the opportunity, if she'd only received it the day she vanished, but I can still picture her trying to play hot cross buns on her recorder. So anyway, Christine got off the bus and she went home. She rummaged around and found a nickel and went to the convenience store to get some gum. So sometime between 4 and 4:30, I think it was closer to 4, she was actually seen walking into the nearby convenience store to buy this pack of gum. Leslie went to the park, and of course Christine didn't arrive. Leslie went home by 4:10 and called Christine's house but got no answer. Now, reports are a little bit unclear. Some reports say that Janet had called Leslie's house to see if Leslie knew where Christine was. Some other reports say that Leslie called Christine's house to see where Christine was. But anyway, when Janet and Kenny got home that day at 4:10 p.m., just minutes really after Christine had hopped off the bus, they found several items to indicate that she had, at minimum, made it into the home. The mail was removed from the mailbox and was on the kitchen counter, something that she often did if she was the first to reach the mailbox. They also found her backpack, and they also found her coat that was hung up on a hook that was way higher than Christine would have been able to reach herself. One other thing that they found very puzzling was her prized bike. Instead of being stood up with its kickstand, it was on the ground, partially blocking the entranceway to the home. And Janet would later say that that bike was her pride and joy, and she would have never just thrown it down. Assuming that Christine went out to play, Janet and Kenny weren't immediately panicked, though as the hours slowly began passing by, their concern grew as it was highly unlikely Christine to not have come home by dinner time. Janet then began calling the parents of her friends, hoping to locate her. She was hoping that Christine may have simply lost track of time. However, as each call ended and nobody had seen her after school that day, Janet and Kenny began searching on their own. They went around town, even stopped by the park, but there was no sign of Christine. With her stomach sinking, Janet called the police at 7 p.m. and reported her daughter missing. The responding agency was the York Regional Police, and they quickly assembled a team to search the town. And it was during this search that investigators began to put together a thin timeline of events that led up to Christine's disappearance. So the mail on the counter when Janet and Kenny got home was something that Christine often did, so we know that she was at least inside the house, and the time that she got home would have been just before or around 4 p.m. Several witnesses would come forward saying that they had seen Christine between 4 and 4:30 walking away from the family home towards Main Street where the corner store was located. And the store was a short distance from the park where she was supposed to meet her friend Leslie Chipman. In fact, you could actually see the park from the entrance to the store. So some witness timelines seem to be a little bit screwy and don't really jive with the actual timeline, so I am assuming here that the witnesses just had the times off by a bit, and only by minutes, but those minutes make a big difference in this case, because Christine was only alone for a matter of about 10 to 15, maybe 20 minutes. She had only got off her bus just before or at 4 p.m. Her mom and her brother were home by 4:10 p.m. So that is a very, very short window of time. One witness said that he had seen Christine outside the store carrying her plastic recorder sometime between 3:45 and 3:50. I don't think that time is necessarily right because she probably wasn't off the bus yet. Also, in the first few days of the investigation, multiple tipsters called in to investigators to say that they had seen a female child who resembled Christine in one of several different vehicles heading in different directions. While these tips were investigated, they didn't lead to any developments, and really investigators didn't know how many were reliable or how many were just someone seeing a car driving by with a female child in it. All investigators really knew at this point was that Christine had disappeared somewhere between her home, the store, and the park. Her bike left haphazardly on the ground, and her coat being on a hook that she could not reach, though, were pretty good indications that she may have been taken from her home. That's what I think, anyways. Police set up a command post at the local fire hall, and volunteers helped with an extensive search. Bob, Christine's father, was released from the detention center so that he could help search for his daughter. Police started their investigation with the assumption that most abductions are not random, and usually the abductor knows the victim, so they asked the Jessops to provide a list of everyone who had access to their home without supervision. Despite a widespread and exhaustive search involving police and local volunteers, nothing showed where Christine could have been taken. It didn't take the police very long in this situation to label Christine's missing persons case as an abduction. Because for one, her mother, Janet, was adamant that Christine would not have ran away, and I mean she was only 9 years old. There was simply no way that a 9-year-old child could have avoided the authorities in such an extensive search. Missing persons flyers were made and placed all over town, fanning out further and further. There wasn't a single person in Queensville or surrounding areas who had not heard about Christine's disappearance, which completely rocked the tight-knit community of Queensville. The months passed. Her birthday was on November 29th, and by this time, a month and a half later, police had developed few, if any, leads. Christmas was especially difficult for the family, as you can imagine. The tragic answer to where Christine was and what had happened to her came on New Year's Eve, 1984. A man named Fred Patterson and his 2 daughters were out looking for their dog on the large wooded property next to their home. Patterson spotted something unusual, what he thought looked like a pile of garbage next to a half-dug pit. He walked closer and realized with horror what it was, a corpse that was badly decomposed. In the tall grass lay a recorder with Christine Jessop written on it. So this field, where Christine was found, was located in the community of Sunderland, which is about 41 kilometers east of Queensville. I'm really not going to go into much detail about how Christine was found. Those details, like I said, those details are easily found online if you want to look them up. But for her modesty, I will not describe in detail what the monster who took her life left her like, but her autopsy would determine that the 9-year-old child had been beaten and murdered by stabs to her upper body, she had been sexually assaulted, and the killer had left behind DNA in her underwear. The Jessop family was absolutely devastated. Christine was laid to rest in the Queensville cemetery not far from her home where she often played. Right from the very beginning, this investigation was flawed. As soon as the police arrived the day she vanished, it was reported that friends, family, and the police were coming and going from the house, touching this and touching that, and potentially contaminating any evidence. One example of how the crime scene was not preserved, well, I'm calling it the crime scene. I really do not know that, but I think from what we do know, it probably was. Regardless, the scene should have been preserved, and the scene would have been the Jessop home. So just one example of the bad police work in this case, the newspaper that was on the counter, all the plastic on it, had been thrown in the garbage. It wasn't even tested for fingerprints. The field where Christine was found lied on the border of the Durham Regional Police Force and the York Police Force. So the York Police Force had no experience with this type of crime, and that probably did hinder the investigation right from the very beginning. Because Christine was found on the border of both regional police forces, the decision was made to hand the case over to the Durham Regional Police. And the investigation determined that Christine had been left in the field in Sunderland the day that she disappeared. What was found in the field with her was her recorder, her clothes, and there was a hair found in her necklace. 2 veteran detectives were assigned to the case. They were Detective Bernie Fitzpatrick and Detective John Shepard, who went by Fitz and Shep. The original investigating force, the York Regional Police, had accumulated boxes of notes containing leads from their investigation, but as Fitz would later testify, he and Shep largely disregarded their work, deeming it amateurish and a waste of time. Now today, Fitzpatrick asserts that he in fact did spend considerable time examining the notes, but I don't know. These 2 detectives pursued other leads, like the family friend who had uttered bizarre, dark sayings, the neighborhood kid who carried a knife, and even Janet Jessop. None, however, panned out. But on February the 14th, 1985, Fitz and Shep visited the grieving Jessops and asked for a list of suspects. The Jessops couldn't name anyone with any kind of confidence, but the detectives pressed harder, prompting them for anyone who stood out. Next door lived the Morans. Janet recalled that Guy Paul Morin, a 24-year-old who was the Morin's son, hadn't participated in the search for Christine when just about everyone else in Queensville had. She also happened to mention that Guy Paul played the clarinet and kept honeybees. Fitz scribbled in his notepad words that would destroy a life. Quote, "Clarinet player, weird type guy." Now the Morins were a tight-knit family. Guy Paul was kind, respectful. He had no criminal record. He didn't drink or smoke. His only infractions were a couple of speeding tickets. But police began zeroing in on him as their prime suspect. He worked for a furniture company and lived with his parents and led a somewhat closed-off life. He didn't have a large circle of friends. He wasn't the kind of guy who went out partying. He played several instruments, including the clarinet. He had a small band that he would play with, and he had a girlfriend. He had no history of arrests, no trouble with the law, nothing whatsoever in his past that indicated that he could have been involved in the abduction of a child. Yet, he became the prime suspect as police grasped to find answers to a case with virtually no leads. Allegedly, interest in him was also stoked when several other people referred to him as somewhat strange. And apparently, a dog that was used in the search for Christine had allegedly made an indication at the Morin family vehicle. When asked, the police were given permission to search this vehicle, at which time they recovered several fibers, which were sent to the Ontario Centre of Forensic Sciences. The more police looked, the more they felt Guy knew more than he was sharing. But he had a rock-solid alibi. According to the company where he worked, the time card for that Wednesday showed that he had clocked out at 3:32 p.m. After leaving work, he stopped at a store and bought a lottery ticket, which the clerk confirmed selling to him. He then went grocery shopping, filled the family vehicle with gas, and arrived home between 5 and 5:30 p.m. His brother-in-law confirmed this, and he told police that as he was leaving the Morin home between 5 and 5:30 that evening, he seen Guy pulling into the driveway, and they even had a small chat. According to his parents and his sister, after unloading the groceries, he went into the house and took a nap. waking up around 6:30 p.m., and the rest of the evening he worked outside with his father, doing home repairs. Police would later say that his family were either wrong about the times or were covering up for him, despite at no time was there ever any evidence produced to contradict Guy's alibi. Instead, police focused on people saying that he was weird. They focused on the fact that he did not help with the search for Christine. They focused on the fact that he did not attend Christine's funeral, all leading them to believe that he was, well, weird and suspicious, and he didn't really help himself in that department either, mind you. He did not say anything I don't think that justified what happened to him, but yes, I can see how detectives thought some of his answers were, well, weird. But weird does not mean murderer. There was a partial profile developed by John Douglas of the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, and he said that the unsub was likely a loner, a white male, early to mid-20s, which seemed to fit Guy Paul Morin, but really, years later when the true killer was revealed, this profile loosely fit him too. On the afternoon of February 22nd, 1985, Fitz and Shep wandered over and engaged Morin in conversation. They were being casual and friendly, and they invited him into their car for a chat. How well did he know Christine Jessop, they wanted to know. Not well, he said. She was more than 16 years his junior, so there really wasn't much cause for interaction. He once helped her catch her dog Freckles, who was running loose, and he remembered talking to her about gardening. Another time, he said he went over to the Jessops to help light the pilot on the Jessop's furnace, and that was the extent of it. The detectives asked about his whereabouts on the day that Christine went missing. He knew he had been at work, the furniture manufacturing facility, which was 57 kilometers to the south. As I mentioned, the detectives would later discover that he had punched out with a card at 3:32 p.m., which meant that he couldn't have returned home any earlier than 4:14 p.m., too late to actually abduct Christine before Janet and Kenny got home at 4:10 p.m., but he actually didn't even get home till between 5 and 5:30. The detectives asked why hadn't Guy helped with the search for Christine on the night she went missing. He said that had the Jessops asked him, of course he would have pitched in, but he and his father were installing weeping tall around the home's foundation, and it seemed like the entire town was already involved. One more person wouldn't add much. To a man whose North Star was rationality, this explanation made all the sense in the world to Guy Paul Morin, but to investigators, it sounded like guilt. The detectives asked him what he thought of Christine, and Morin described her as, quote, sweet and innocent, and Morin, who had apparently a habit of filling anticipated lulls with whatever thought was in his head, added, quote, but they sometimes grow up to be corrupt. Today, he doesn't deny having said that, but he says he meant it in a general sense as girls become adults, they lose their childlike innocence. To the detectives, it was motive. This weird type neighbor had sought retribution for the inevitable, intoxicating promiscuity of women on Christine. Morin left the car that day oblivious to the fact that he had just become the prime suspect in the abduction and murder of Christine Jessop. For Fitz and Shep, the easy part, finding a suspect, was done. The difficult part now was making the evidence line up. The most problematic issue was Morin's rock-solid alibi. He simply couldn't have traveled the 57 kilometers from work in time to abduct Christine before Janet and Kenny arrived home at 4:10 p.m. So they retraced Kenny and Janet's route on the day that Christine was abducted and suggested to Janet that she must have remembered it all wrong. She replied that she'd made no such mistake. She knew she had to make an important call to her husband's lawyer at 4:50 p.m., and she remembered looking at the clock on the wall when she got home. Perhaps, suggested Fitz, the clock was running slow? Janet allowed that was conceivable, and gradually, over the months that followed, their steady pressure eroded her confidence, and she eventually revised her timing. It was, she decided, closer to 4:20 p.m., perhaps even as late as 4:35 p.m., that she'd returned home. And that was the key that sealed Guy Morin's fate. A few weeks later, Guy went to his jazz group and learned that the band leader's daughter, accompanied by her friend and a classmate, who happened to be an undercover police officer. Guy didn't know this, of course. So anyways, he was told that the girls were doing a cosmetic class project on hair analysis. She asked the group whether they would mind if she plucked a few strands of everyone's hair. Morin didn't mind at all. After she left, she discarded all the hair samples but his, which she handed over to her colleagues Fitz and Shep, who took it to the Center of Forensic Sciences, and where a forensic scientist named Stephanie Nisnik would perform hair analysis. Now, hair analysis was a reliable way to exclude suspects. For example, if a blonde hair was found, but the suspect had brown hair, it was unreliable, though, for including suspects, that is, proving a definitive match. That's because characteristics of hairs from one person's head vary from hair to hair, and even the characteristics of a single hair may differ from tip to bulb. And in this case, especially after so much time being exposed to the elements, Christine had been out there for as much as 90 days, the hair in her necklace had severely degraded. Nothing probative at all could be gleaned from this hair. Yet, Nisnik told Fitz and Shep the hairs were macroscopically similar, which essentially meant that to the naked eye, both hairs were the same color. Going further, she said that Morin's hair was consistent with the necklace hair. Consistent was the word that the detectives needed to hear. Now, they had their man. Next, Fitz and Shep hired an FBI profiler who delivered a sketch of the killer. A high school graduate, a high school educated white male between 19 and 26 who wears sloppy clothes and lives in Queensville. The full profile was much more extensive, saying that the person had acne, physical handicap, a history of arson and voyeurism, macho effect, and more. In a press release, though, the cops admitted the characteristics that they didn't like, which Fitz and Shep would later claim was a ploy to unnerve Morin. So in other words, they tried to make the profile sound more like Morin. And actually, at home, his father, who was watching the nightly news, joked to his son, quote, "My God, that sounds like you. You're the grubby one around here." Guy Paul Morin was on his way to band practice on the evening of April 22nd, 1985, when he saw flashing lights in his rearview mirror. He assumed a passing police cruiser had noticed that he wasn't wearing a seatbelt, so he pulled over, feeling a bit sheepish. He had no idea that 14 other officers had sealed off the area. He watched as 2 cops approached the car and was surprised to recognize the friendly detectives he'd spoken to weeks earlier. Fitz and Shep told him they were arresting him for the murder of Christine Jessop. He said, quote, "What? You're joking." They brought him to their headquarters, where on his way to the interrogation room, he spotted the woman who had plucked his hair at band practice. Until that moment, he'd assumed it had all been an honest mistake. Now, the reality of his situation was really setting in. He was about to take the fall for a crime that he didn't commit. Morin was tried for the abduction and murder of Christine Jessop in 1986. One thing from this trial besides the outcome that sticks out is the fact that there had been a cigarette butt found at the scene, assuming that the scene, of course, was the Jessop home. But when police realized that Morin wasn't a smoker, miraculously, this cigarette butt was conveniently lost. Mysterious red fibers found on Christine's body and in Morin's car were presented to the court as evidence that the little girl had been inside the car. But an anonymous letter later claimed that the technician testing the fibers had worn a red sweater and no lab coat. Facts that Nisnik's boss investigated and ultimately kept to himself. And as for the Morins' story that their son hadn't arrived home on the day of the disappearance until 5:30 p.m., a psychologist who interviewed the Morins testified that they were part of a secretive, protective, pathological family system. And as if the evidence wasn't already damning enough, the police planted an undercover police sergeant in Morin's cell, and he emerged days later with quite a story. He said that Morin had made stabbing motions towards his own chest, demonstrating the way he'd committed the crime. He also explained that Morin had confessed by saying that he would re-drum the innocent. The story, according to Morin, had been horrifically mangled. Hobbs had asked him about his favorite movies. Morin had just seen the 1980 horror film The Shining, wherein the little boy repeatedly croaks "redrum," which is murder backwards, in the film's scariest scene. Morin couldn't remember the title, so referenced redrum instead. But in the end, the jury in this trial decided that Morin was not guilty. When the verdict was read aloud, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Kenny wept openly, and immediately afterwards the Crown told the media that they were considering an appeal. Quote, "What can you say?" Bob Jessop told the press. "We lived a year and a half of hell, and now the hell goes on." Many people believed that Guy Paul Morin was guilty. The media camped outside the Morins' home. The family found menacing notes in their mailbox. One night, someone even threw a beer bottle through their window. The Crown retried Guy in May of 1990 on a technicality related to instructions that the original judge had given to the jury regarding the meaning of reasonable doubt. Much of the original evidence had gone missing from the Center of Forensic Sciences, including 2 of Christine's bones, many of Nisnik's work notes, and some 150 to 200 hair and fiber slides that had not been made exhibits at the original trial. The jury retired on July 23, 1992, and 8 days later returned a unanimous verdict of guilty. One jury member, later interviewed by Lyndon McIntyre of the 50 State, said she knew Morin was guilty by the way he never looked at the jury while he was testifying. Morin, 32 now by this point, was sentenced to life in prison. When the judge asked him if he had any comment, he said the same thing that he'd been saying since the day that he was arrested. Quote, "I am not guilty of this crime." Then he added, quote, "It's a travesty of justice what's happened today. I'm appealing." He was placed in the Kingston pen, and as you may know, the pen is full of some of the worst people. But a child rapist and a child murderer, well, he was the worst of the worst. Morin learned that many inmates wanted to get their own justice. But thankfully, for him, the most feared inmate was on Morin's side. He had followed his story all along and decided that Guy was innocent, and he put the word out that Guy wasn't to be touched. Pretty damn lucky, I'd say. In February of 1993, Guy and his attorney successfully filed for appeal, and he was granted bail. By that point, he'd lived through nearly a decade of hell. He'd spent 2.5 years in courtrooms and nearly 18 months locked away in 6 different facilities. His parents had mortgaged their house over and over to keep up with his legal bills, which amounted to roughly $500,000. Advancements in DNA testing in the mid-1990s provided a pivotal breakthrough. In January of 1995, DNA analysis conclusively excluded Morin as the source of the semen found on Christine's underwear. This led to his exoneration and release from prison after serving 18 months. In the public eye, though, suspicion would follow Guy until Christine's real killer was found. Now, I just very briefly went over the ordeal that Guy went through. Trust me, I could do an entire podcast episode on just what Guy Paul Morin went through. Not only what Guy Paul Morin went through, but some very disturbing things that came out in the trials. For one, years later, the Jessops would admit that Durham police had insisted that Morin had committed the crime and in not so many words suggested that if the family had been wrong about their own timeline, Morin could have had a window of opportunity, which this all led to the family testifying that the times were different than they actually remembered them, hoping to help close the net on this man that they had been promised was the killer. There was also even a point during the trials that some information had surfaced about Kenny, and he had even been seen at one point as a suspect. Some disturbing details were revealed. Kenny had revealed that he and Christine had both been sexually assaulted by 2 older boys when they were young. He says that could have started when she was as young as 2 years old, making Kenny only 7 years old, and it continued for several years. They were both small children, and they were both being abused. Kenny revealed that at the insistence of these older boys, he had also assaulted Christine. And I really don't want to get into too much more detail because honestly, it is irrelevant to this case and I don't want to drag Kenny through the mud because at the end of the day, he was a child too, and who knows what was being said and done to him to make him comply. In the days after Christine disappeared, suspicion swirled in Queensville. The Jessops prayed for her safe return, but the longer she was gone, the more their hope disappeared. At the Jessop home, Christmas passed with no tree and only a few presents for Kenny. No one really felt like celebrating. By December 31st, 90 excruciating days since she disappeared, while the whole world was set to ring in the new year, in the small town of Sunderland, Christine's body was found in a field. When the Jessops heard the news, they were shattered. The case shifted from the York Police to the Durham Police, which was unlike anything that this police department had ever dealt with before. Among the many puzzling elements of the case was the location of the body. Why Sunderland? It was all country roads, farmland, and forests, not exactly far from Queensville, but not exactly close either. 4 years after Christine was abducted, Bob and Janet sold her home in Queensville to get away from the painful memories. After the debacle with Guy Paul Morin and the police royally fucking up this case, Kenny felt resentment towards the police for pushing him to lie about the timeline and pursuing Guy because if not, then maybe the real killer could have been caught. In the years after, Kenny created a website and social media pages to try and gather information about Christine's murder, but eventually had to turn away from them because of the overwhelming emotional impact. It became too much to live with, and some people still thought that he was involved. Bob and Janet divorced, and from what I have read, Bob never spoke to his son Kenny again after the revelations that came out in court of how Kenny had sexually abused Christine along with the two older boys. On October 3rd, 2024, in the Queensville cemetery behind the farmhouse where 9-year-old Christine Jessop went missing exactly 4 decades before, her mother Janet was reunited with her daughter. Quote, "It was a beautiful service," says her son Kenny. "I had my closure." Janet died in March of 2024 at the age of 81, finally at peace with the knowledge that her daughter's killer had been identified after she'd waited for so long. Kenny Jessop was just 14 years old when his sister disappeared. He has said that he and Christine had a typical brother-sister relationship, and she tagged along behind him in everything that he did. He and his mother had reached a reconciliation with Guy Paul Morin after having initially believed that he was guilty, but realized after, of course, that he wasn't. Quote, "I'm glad Paul's completely rid of whispering and fears," said Kenny. Bob remarried, but Janet remained single for the rest of her life, and she spent the last years of her life living in a retirement community and maintained a close relationship with her son Kenny. So once Guy was found not responsible and exonerated, 11 years had passed since Christine had been murdered. Now what? The Toronto police took over the case the same year that Guy was exonerated, 1995, and they launched a task force to reinvestigate the killing that saw detectives interview 300 people and obtain DNA samples from scores of men to compare against a semen stain left on Christine's underwear. With no luck, this task force disbanded in 1998, but remained active and was passed on to cold case detectives around the year 2000. YorkRegion.com wrote a 3-part series on Christine's murder, and as a result of that, multiple people called in tips. Now, criminal profiler John Douglas believed that Christine probably knew her killer, and the child more than likely went along willingly with this person. He described the crime scene as unorganized and sloppy, leading him to believe that the killer was also unorganized and sloppy. He told TheStar.com that the killer had likely had a criminal record for arson or animal cruelty, possibly had scars on his face, and may have been experiencing an emotional upheaval due to a breakup or divorce between his parents. Considering the remote location that Christine was found in, police believe that her killer was someone who knew Queensville and Sunderland quite well. Over the years, the Toronto police issued news releases on the case in the hopes that the reminder might dredge up some key memory from someone, somewhere. Each time, they were reminded that the saga was still as fresh for the public as it was for the police. Quote, "A lot of cases, you put it out there, and it might generate 1 or 2 tips, said Detective Steve Smith. But when we put the Jessop case out there, hundreds of tips would come in. Officers would investigate each one, either cross-referencing the name against the list of 300 people they'd already eliminated via DNA testing or pursuing the lead further. By the time that Detective Smith had joined the cold case unit, they had bought on an extra staff member just to sort through the Jessop leads. But it wasn't working. Then in May of 2019, Detective Smith heard about a 2-week seminar at the Ontario Police College featuring a session on forensic genealogy. And this would be the first time that the technique was used in Canada. So the idea is using existing crime scene DNA, run it through public databases to find relatives, then apply old school family tree building to identify the killer. So Detective Smith signed up, took the course, and a few months later, someone from Othram Incorporated, a Texas-based genetic testing startup, got in touch. Before long, Detective Smith received authorization from the Toronto Police to try out genetic testing. He submitted the DNA from Christine Jessop's underwear to Othram, which generated a profile and uploaded it to a database called GEDmatch. So this returned roughly 33,000 names. In other words, it would take years and a small fortune to find out who did this. But Smith refused to give up, and he also ran the DNA through a second database called Family Tree, which returned results of about 400 names. Next, he turned to an in-house genealogist who was also a veteran of the Toronto Police. Long story short, over the course of 8 months, they were able to flesh out a family tree all the way up to a man named Henry Hoover Jr., who had been born in 1804 in Lennox, Ontario, near Belleville. This was a major milestone, but a daunting amount of work still remained to populate the tree back down to determine which one of Henry Hoover's great-great-grandsons had killed Christine. Eventually, they arrived at 2 possible families. Detective Smith and his team investigated members of both serendipitously, and eventually they narrowed their scope to a single person, Kelvin Hoover. It was a name that Detective Smith had never heard before, and it had never come up in the thousands of tips that had flooded in since 1984. So today, the Toronto Police use a file management server that allows them to electronically search all files from a major case. Now, the Jessop paperwork filled 4 skids that were accumulated from the York, Durham, and Toronto Police. So Smith punched in Hoover's various addresses over the years into this system, and to his surprise, he got a hit. Hoover's former Scarborough address, a townhouse by the Toronto Zoo, was in one of the notebooks. Hoover, Detective Smith learned, was a Jessop family friend who had been listed as a close contact at the time of Christine's abduction. He'd had regular access to the Jessop home as well. His wife at the time, Heather, had been interviewed, and the notes from her interview suggested that Kelvin Hoover was probably aware that Christine would be alone on October 3rd, 1984. Finally, Smith had his man. He typed Hoover's name into 2 separate police databases to figure out where he lived and whether he had a criminal record. But there would be no justice for Christine Jessop. Back in the summer of 2015, Hoover lived just outside of Port Hope in a small bungalow with one of his sons. He was a sad, anxious, isolated man. His doctor had prescribed him a tranquilizer called clonazepam for his anxiety and panic attacks, but it wasn't working. Quote, "The pills," he texted one of his sons, "they're messing with my head." When the son he lived with went to a wedding, he opened a bottle of red wine, stepped into the garage, sealed the door with tape, placed headphones over his ears, and flipped on the generator. With carbon monoxide spewing into the room, he sat down in a lawn chair, opened a bottle of his tranquilizers, and waited for life to drain from his body. He left the world as cowardly as he lived in it, never confessing to what he had done to Christine. In the bathroom off the main bedroom, he'd affixed a yellow sticky note to the mirror, quote, "Hope you all have a good life." By the time his son returned from the wedding, he was slumped in his chair and cold to the touch. Detective Smith was able to get a DNA sample of Hoover's from the coroner's office, who had hung on to 2 blood samples of his, and when the results came back, they said that Kelvin Hoover could not be excluded. It was 3 trillion times more likely that Kelvin Hoover was the source of the DNA found in Christine Jessop's underwear. The murder of Christine Jessop had been solved 36 years after the fact. Detective Smith delivered the news personally to Janet Jessop. She couldn't quite place Kelvin Hoover, but she remembered that he was a colleague of Bob's and that they might have gotten together for barbecues back in the day. She remembered Heather, Kelvin's ex-wife, as a good friend and a funny duck. Bob had been tortured by the thought that he would die never knowing who killed his little girl. He remembered Kelvin Hoover vaguely as a work contact from a long time ago. Never in all of the years that had passed had Bob or Janet ever suspected Kelvin Hoover. Like everyone else who knew the man, they are left with more questions than answers. Among one of those questions is one that haunts Detective Smith. How likely is it that Kelvin Hoover raped and murdered a little girl and never did it again? Because Hoover traveled so widely, often alone, the list of potential victims is actually quite large. Police don't know, but they're looking. His DNA has been cross-referenced with databases in Canada, the United States, the UK, but so far there have been no matches. Where to even begin with Kelvin Hoover? Well, let's just start with the interview that his wife, at the time Christine was abducted, Heather, gave to the police the day after Christine was abducted. So Sergeant Raymond Bunce of the York Regional Police Services interviewed Heather the day after Christine disappeared. She said that her husband Calvin was at work the afternoon that Christine went missing. And that's it. It went no further. Calvin was never interviewed. A month later, Janet Jessop told the same investigator that Calvin Hoover was among several friends that would be allowed to enter her house without a family member being in the house. Still, there is no record of Calvin Hoover ever being interviewed in relation to the disappearance of Christine Jessop. Calvin Hoover was 28 years old at the time that Christine was murdered. He was a tradesman from Scarborough who had a predilection for drinking, partying, and gambling. He was said to have a certain charisma that could envelop the room. He was also said to be profoundly selfish. While he was generally amiable to strangers and his co-workers, he possessed a nasty, vindictive streak that he would often unleash on those who knew him best. So Calvin and Heather, his ex-wife, had met in 1977 when she was just 20 years old. She had 2 sons from a previous relationship, whom Calvin later adopted, and the couple then went on to have 2 sons together. In 1984, the Hoovers were living in North Scarborough, now part of Toronto's East End, and both were working at Eastern Independent Telecom, where they met Christine's father, Bob Jessop. Heather was a dispatcher, Calvin was a cable installer, and Bob was the lead hand of the cable installers. The Hoovers and the Jessops started spending time together, having barbecues, and spending birthdays together, and Heather said that she and Bob's wife, Janet, hit it off. She recalled her 2 older sons, who were 10 and 7 at the time, would play with Christine, and they all got along very well. And Christine, quote, loved my younger one. That was her 3rd son, who was just a toddler at the time. The 2 moms became particularly close. Janet jokingly called Heather the Goofy Newfie, because Heather was originally from Newfoundland. And Heather sometimes babysat Christine, who referred to her as Auntie Heather. Though they lived more than 50 kilometers apart, Janet and Heather would meet often to share a pot of tea and watch the kids play. On October the 1st, 1984, Janet visited Heather. Bob was in jail for the past 3 weeks, serving a term for committing fraud against some seniors, which I've said I don't know the exact details. Janet mentioned that she and her son Kenny were going to visit Bob on October 3rd at the detention center, and that Kenny had a dentist appointment, and that this trip would overlap with the time that Christine would be getting home from school, and Janet would be leaving her daughter alone for a little while. She didn't think that Christine was old enough to go to this detention center. Now, the time that Christine was supposed to be alone would have only been about 15 minutes. Janet really didn't want to do this, but it didn't seem like there was any other way. It's possible, even probable, that Calvin Hoover overheard that comment and knew that Christine would be home alone. Or perhaps maybe even Heather had innocently relayed this information to her husband. For Calvin, this was the perfect opportunity. It'd be a very dangerously brief opportunity, though. There would only be minutes between when Christine stepped off her school bus and when Janet and Kenny returned home. 2 days later, though, Calvin put his plan into action. And since Christine knew Calvin as a family friend, she might have hopped right into his car without even having to be really convinced. Maybe he even told her that he was taking her to see her father in jail. Or maybe he used force. She was only a small girl. However it happened, though, by 4:10 p.m., little Christine was in Calvin's car, speeding towards the unknown. And we do believe that Christine did head to the store around 4, so the time for him to strike was very, very short, like literally just minutes. The nature of the work that Calvin did gave him cover to come and go from the home whenever he wanted, and he took advantage of that. He would occasionally leave for hours at a time, day and night, speeding off without any explanation. Heather remembered getting home from work on October 3rd and learning that Christine had disappeared. Quote, I dropped everything and went right to Queensville. Unlike Morin, Calvin Hoover had the good sense to keep his mouth shut in the days and weeks after Christine's murder. He actually had the balls to show up not just for the funeral, but at the wake too, extending his condolences to her family. Police officers were in attendance at both, and even took pictures of attendees, but of course they didn't know. I wonder, what must have Calvin Hoover thought to be there, just steps from the police? But he had no criminal record, and he exhibited no outward signs of depravity. Police have since learned that Calvin Hoover had an old school friend who lived in Sunderland, and they would meet often to go kayaking and backcountry camping. Because of this familiarity with the area, Calvin would have known that a few meters into the dense forest, off just about any back road, he would be uninterrupted and unseen by passing motorists. Detective Steve Smith said, quote, "We believe that's how Calvin Hoover was familiar with where Christine's body was left." And he also said that police have no reason to think that the friend, who has since died, was in any way connected to Christine's murder. As the years passed, Heather said she tried to keep Christine's memory alive and would regularly visit her gravesite, all while her husband consoled her. Quote, "He watched me go to her gravesite for 10 years. It's mind-boggling. I didn't know this man." Heather said that their marriage became difficult and they separated in late 1993. She described him as a man who became moody and grumpy. Quote, "Those last 2-3 years were hell for me and the kids. He was never the father he should have been." Since identifying Calvin Hoover as the killer, Detective Steve Smith and the Toronto Police have been painstakingly putting together a timeline of his life. They've spoken with almost 100 people who've come forward with information about him, and what has emerged is a profile of a man who had difficult relationships with close family members, but generally he treated his friends and colleagues well. Quote, "It seems like he had addiction problems, probably both alcohol as well as drugs at certain times in his life," said Detective Steve Smith. Calvin Hoover was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 2010 or 11. According to Heather, she couldn't remember exactly when. Detective Steve Smith said in the mid to late 1990s, there was a change in him. Quote, "The addiction really kicked in and probably a bit of depression. Maybe there was some guilt for what he had done. We really don't know the answer to that." But Calvin Hoover, after he divorced Heather, moved around the Greater Toronto and Hamilton areas, living in various houses and townhomes in Oshawa, Pickering, Ajax, North York, and Waterdown. 1991, a former friend and colleague described Hoover to CBC News as nervous and anxious, and that he couldn't handle his liquor very well. I wonder what Calvin Hoover thought when he picked up the newspaper and saw the headline, "Musician who lived next door, charged with Christine's murder." I'd say he felt like the cat that ate the canary, smug and satisfied. It must have seemed miraculous. Imagine his relief when he heard the news of Guy Paul Morin's conviction. He probably followed the details of this case very closely. By the time Morin was put away for life, Calvin, Heather, and their 4 boys were living in a 2-story suburban home in Oshawa. By all appearances, they were living a blessed existence. But the truth was, they were slowly drowning in debt. 1991, he had to declare bankruptcy. He was battling various afflictions, including undiagnosed at the time bipolar disorder, depression, and periods of anxiety. Now, Calvin was always a drinker, but when he heard the news that Guy Paul Morin had been exonerated, he became a constant presence at local pubs, usually telling Heather and the kids that he was headed out to work. To hear that Guy had been exonerated because of DNA must have scared the shit out of him. He had to know that police would eventually catch up with him. They had his DNA after all. It would only be a matter of time before that knock came at the door. By 1996, the Hoovers had downsized to a low-rent housing complex in Ajax. Their marriage was a mess. They had long lost touch with Bob and Janet Jessop. Hoover continued to gamble and do various drugs. One night, he got drunk and crashed his truck. The police charged him with a DUI and confiscated his license for a year. Finally, Heather had enough, and they soon divorced. Hoover hopped around the region, and he had been seeing a co-worker from Burlington named Joanne Roca for quite a bit, and they shared a fondness for gambling, and in 2003, they married in Las Vegas. Joanne died of natural causes in 2009, and she never knew what kind of monster that she was sleeping with every night. When she passed away, Calvin Hoover wrote on her condolences page, quote, "I love you for being a special friend who shared such warmth and care. I love you for being everything that meant the most to me." In 2014, he attempted what the police deemed to be suicide by motor vehicle, but he survived. In 2015, he actually did take his own life. As for Heather, she said, quote, "It's just too bad his punishment wasn't worse. He could have been caught a long time ago. A long time ago." She had kept a photo of Christine that the little girl had given her as a daily reminder of her beautiful, abbreviated life, and she visited the gravesite often. Through it all, Calvin assumed the posture of sympathy, doling out words of comfort as she mourned. Heather said the police asked her every question possible in her interview. Quote, I thought they were doing everything they possibly could. I'm sure Janet did too. Little did we know, he was right under our thumbs. As far as she knew, Calvin was at work the afternoon that Christine went missing. Now 37 years later, she wonders why the police didn't probe further. Quote, did they not check his alibi? Obviously not. According to the Toronto police, who took over the case in 1995, Calvin Hoover's name came up in passing a couple of times in the cold case files, listed as a family friend of the Jessops and as Heather's husband, but it doesn't appear that he ever was a suspect. Quote, I've thought many times things could be so different if I had known way back then, if the cops had done their job a little better, said Heather. When the news reached the Jessops, they were relieved to finally know who took their daughter, but shocked to learn that it was someone that was never ever on any of their radars, someone they all basically had forgotten about, more or less. When Bob Jessop found out, he asked, quote, is it true? I never thought I would live long enough to see this. I was stunned to hear it. It's a bit overwhelming. Then he heard it was a man that he knew named Calvin Hoover who died in 2015. Quote, I can't see his face, said Bob. I know he worked for us and did some wiring at the York Regional Police Station. Other than that, he doesn't recall much more about Hoover. Quote, I had 20 guys working for me then. Even though he says he is suffering from the early stages of Alzheimer's, he does have some recollection of Hoover. Quote, I know he lived near us, and I know he was over to our house a few times. I am pretty sure he was over for work-related matters. It was then that he believes that Calvin Hoover first laid eyes on Christine. It breaks my heart, he said. Never once did he ever suspect Calvin Hoover, or even think of him as a suspect, until he was told of this news. And Bob Jessop said that he just wishes that Calvin Hoover was alive. Quote, if I could, I would line him up and blow his brains out. He said the pain of his daughter's murder destroyed him and his family, as well as that of the originally charged and convicted but later cleared Guy Paul Morin and his family. Quote, there were a lot of victims in this. However, he said, 9-year-old Christine suffered the most. It's so unfair. And he hopes that his daughter is remembered more than her killer. And he often thinks about what Christine would be like and the life that she could have achieved if it had not been stolen from her. You don't get over something like that, he said. Bob said, quote, he wants to thank the police for staying on top of it. I am happy now to know who it is. It's a miracle, a real-life miracle. And those were the words that were echoed by Kenny Jessop, who kept repeating that after he learned that the DNA evidence had revealed the man who had abducted and killed his 9-year-old sister. For the first time since she disappeared from their home in Queensville, Ontario, he said his mother, Janet, had found some small peace. Quote, she's happy with the news. She's upset it was someone we knew well. For the first time in 36 years, she won't go to bed praying to find out who killed her daughter. It's a miracle. I can't find another word for it. And the announcement of Calvin Hoover being Christine's killer was also a kind of vindication for Guy Paul Morin, who said, quote, I was sure that one day DNA would reveal the real killer, and now it has. I am relieved for Christine's mother, Janet, and her family, and hope this will give them some peace of mind. They have been through a dreadful ordeal for 36 years since they lost Christine in 1984. Kenny Jessop has also said that now, thinking back, hindsight's always 20/20, that Calvin Hoover makes sense as the murderer, because Heather was a very close friend of his mother's, and she worked alongside of his father as a receptionist, and the families spent time together. And he said that Heather was one of the 3 people who knew that on the day that Christine disappeared, that he and his mother would be headed to the detention center and that he had a dentist appointment. Quote, my mother called my father's lawyer, his boss, and her friend Heather Hoover. He also said, quote, in the background, Heather would have heard Christine having a meltdown because she couldn't come with us to the jail. She was too young. Kenny says he believes that Heather may have told Calvin Hoover the information as she was relaying Christine's yelling and screaming during the phone conversation. He also said that very few people knew about his father's legal troubles or the fact that he was locked up at the time. Quote, I said from day one, it was someone we knew, someone who knew that he was in jail. Kenny thinks that Kelvin Hoover could have also used this knowledge to persuade Christine to come with him by suggesting that he was going to take her to see her father in jail. On October 3rd, 1984, Christine went to the convenience store to buy gum after returning to an empty house after school, Kenny said. Upon arriving at home, Kenny believes that Christine found Kelvin Hoover, and that could explain why her coat was hung up on a hook that was too high for her to reach. Before they left, he believes Christine ran back into the house to get the recorder she'd received at school that day, probably to show her father. He said that after visiting his father that day, he and his mother Janet went to a Sears store to buy him a watch before going to the dentist. And it was only when they returned home that they discovered Christine's bike haphazardly thrown on the ground near the doorway, which immediately set off alarm bells. Now, Kenny said that Toronto police came across Hoover's name in the Jessop cold case file in 2015 and followed up with an interview. And according to him, it wasn't long after that Hoover committed suicide. But police have said that they never interviewed Kelvin Hoover. Kenny said, quote, "I am overjoyed for Christine. I'm happy no one can point fingers at Guy Paul. I am happy for myself, but the person I am happiest for is Mom. She was starting to believe she would never know." He said that when police finally told him the news, he almost fainted. For Janet, Christine's mother, she just said that she wishes her daughter had the chance to live. Quote, "She should have had that chance." She described Christine as a tomboy who wouldn't hurt a fly. Heather Hoover still has the last photo that Christine Jessop gave her, and she's asked herself so many times since finding out that it was her ex-husband, how the man that she was once so close with could have done such a horrific thing and kept it a secret. Quote, 10 years, he didn't show shit. He didn't show nothing. How does somebody do that? The name Kelvin Hoover was also unfamiliar to Bernie Fitzpatrick, the retired Durham detective, as well as his partner Shep, who was also just as baffled. Kelvin Hoover? That name had never come up, not once. They both said the case has stayed with them, and Fitz had said about Guy Paul Moran, quote, "I feel bad about it, but look, the cops pick up the rocks, it's the Crown attorneys who break the windows." And in the wake of the announcement that Kelvin Hoover was Christine Jessop's killer, a Canadian organization that advocates for the wrongly convicted has called for the further review of police handling of this case, and how presumed killer Kelvin Hoover had evaded scrutiny for over 3 decades, especially since we now know that his name was in the file right from the very beginning. Why wasn't he interviewed? He was a close friend of the family. They asked the family who had access to their home, and they told the police Kelvin Hoover, and he still was not even questioned. Innocence Canada said, quote, "He was identified. Kelvin Hoover should have been identified early on as someone else deserving of close police scrutiny. The failure to hone in on him and closely examine his alibi for the day of Christine's abduction has led to decades of undescribable agony for Mr. Moran and his family, and for the Jessop family." The original investigating force, the York Regional Police, had accumulated boxes of notes containing leads from their investigation. Included in one of those notebooks was the name and address of Kelvin Hoover, but nobody did anything with it. He wasn't even questioned. Christine Jessop was last seen buying a pack of gum at a local convenience store close to her home in Queensville, Ontario on October 3rd, 1984. The 9-year-old vanished and would turn up 3 months later in a field in a town about 41 kilometers away called Sunderland. Police would quickly zero in on her neighbor, Guy Paul Moran, who would be tried twice and eventually sentenced to life, before being exonerated in 1995 by DNA evidence. Still, for another 25 years, her real killer would evade police. When he was finally caught in 2020, to everyone's surprise, he was a friend of the family way back when. Someone the Jessops had told police who had access to their home. Police had even interviewed his wife at the time, but the real culprit, Kelvin Hoover, was never once interviewed. He slipped through the cracks. Even when he was revealed to be the real killer, he again slipped through the cracks and evaded justice, as he had committed suicide in 2015. He had never been a part of the investigation, nor was he ever on the radar of Christine's family, though his name was in Christine's file from the very beginning. He was listed as a family friend who had access to the home, and he was never questioned. Police never asked him for his alibi. But throughout the years, and all the memories, all the painful memories, when Calvin Hoover was revealed to be Christine's killer, her family could hardly recall him. But her brother Kenny would say he always knew that who had taken Christine was someone that knew that their father was in jail. And there was only 3 people that knew that him and his mother were going to that jail that day. And Calvin Hoover's wife was one of them. Though justice will never be fully had for Christine Jessop or her family, at least her family was finally able to have some closure, at least knowing who did this to her. I truly love genetic genealogy and cannot wait to see all of the cold cases that this new technology will solve in the future. And I hope there are a lot of murderers out there who are shaken in their boots.
Thank you for all the support. It truly is appreciated. It still surprises me that anybody would want to support unjust crimes. But for anybody that would like to do that and help support the podcast, I have added a PayPal link to my YouTube page. And again, it is truly appreciated. These stories do take a lot of time to put together. You can follow Unjust Crimes on Facebook and Instagram, and I will put those links in the description to this video. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And until next time, thank you for your time and stay safe out there.